You can hear the excitement in the air because Virtua Fighter is back. 15 years after it was first released in arcades, Virtua Fighter 5 will be returning to home consoles with Ultimate Showdown, a better-looking remaster that'll be punching and kicking its way onto the PlayStation 4 today. This is me playing it right now, and I can indeed confirm that it is a whole lot of fun. To help celebrate this exciting news, I want to take a trip back to the good old days and look at the best and worst games in the Virtua Fighter series. In order to do that, we're going to scour through old issues of Electronic Gaming Monthly to see how they ranked every single port, sequel, expansion, and spin-off of the entire series. Did your favorite installment get a knockout from the critics, or was it pushed straight out of the ring? Find out now as we see how Electronic Gaming Monthly ranks the Virtua Fighter series. We're gonna start our countdown by subverting your expectations. The worst Virtua Fighter game isn't a fighting game at all, but rather an ill-conceived action role-playing game called Virtua Quest. Now, when series fans first heard the name Virtua Fighter RPG being floated around, they whet their appetite for an epic story that combined the best elements of the fighting game series with the grandeur of a Japanese adventure game. This was, after all, the same publisher that had given us Panzer Dragoon Saga, a legendary game that beautifully mashed two genres together. Unfortunately, Virtua Quest did not live up to those lofty heights. It's not even one of Sega's C-tier RPGs. It's just bad, and yet another missed opportunity for Sega. A big part of the problem is that the game was aimed young. Real young. Jeremy started his review by noting that you might as well rename this My First Sega Game. The influence of Virtua Fighter and Phantasy Star Online stands front and center in Virtua Quest, but its too simple gameplay and catch-em-all action are shooting for the same young anime fan crowd as Mega Man Battle Network and Dot Hack. Brian agreed, making this startling comparison. Virtua Quest tries to be so many different things, it's like a troubled teenage boy who needs a sit-down chat with an out-of-touch guidance counselor. The review crew was disappointed in the cheesy storyline, the simple level designs, and the ham-fisted Virtua Fighter cameos. Averaging a pitiful 4.8 out of 10, Virtua Quest is Electronic Gaming Monthly's worst reviewed Virtua Fighter game by a large margin. If you want to know just how big and indulgent the fighting game craze was back in the mid-1990s, then look no further than Virtua Fighter Kids. Yes, this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a version of Virtua Fighter 2 sporting shorter characters with much bigger heads. They aren't really children, at least not in the strictest sense, but rather super deformed versions of the fighters that we all know and love. The result could be seen as either an adorable play on the genre-defining game, or a cynical cash grab where Sega gets you to fork over full price for something that should have been a bonus mode in Virtua Fighter 2. I'll give you one guess which side EGM came down on. Resident Fake Ninja Sushi X almost seemed upset at the very concept. What an idea. Take your best fighting game, replace the graphics with big-headed, unproportioned character files, and release it. Snore! He concluded that it would be great as a $10 add-on, but retail price? No way! He would rather use that money for a 32X. Some of the other critics were a little bit more charitable, but none of them were willing to give the game a full-throated defense. Sean called the game cute, but complained about the iffy gameplay. He also has the most obvious take I've ever seen in an issue of EGM. If you want blood and gore and hurtful-looking body slams, Virtua Fighter Kids is not what you want. Yeah, obviously. With an average of 6.25 out of 10, the critics thought Virtua Fighter Kids was an interesting novelty, but not worth the price. When Virtua Fighter first hit the Saturn in May 1995, critics and consumers had mixed feelings. While everybody agreed that it was a faithful port of one of Sega's most groundbreaking releases, there was a feeling in the air that it was a step down from the current king of the arcade, Virtua Fighter 2. To keep up with the 32-bit battle for supremacy, Sega decided to release Virtua Fighter Remix, an upgraded port that uses the framework of the original game and mixes some of the improvements from the sequel to create the best version of the game yet. So then, if this is indeed the definitive version of Virtua Fighter, then why is it sitting all the way down at number 9? Unfortunately, as they say, timing is everything. This remixed version of the original Virtua Fighter was doomed the moment Sega decided to release it just 2 months before Virtua Fighter 2. It's impossible to compete with the hype of the sequel, especially when all of these critics have been playing the launch version of Virtua Fighter for a number of months. Mark was not impressed with the double dip, noting that the only noticeable changes in the game are the graphics. He liked that the glitches that plagued the original version of the game had been resolved, but concluded that it's just more of the same. This seemed to be the take that most of the editors had. Some liked it more, some less, but they all agreed that it's a disappointing rehash that should probably be ignored with Virtua Fighter 2 just around the corner. With an average score of 7.25 out of 10, this remix ends up being the best version of the original Virtua Fighter, but also the most disappointing. Funny how that works. When Virtua Fighter first hit arcades in 1993, it felt like a line in the sand had been drawn between the new technology and the old. All it took was one look at those low-res polygons to know that the Genesis was not gonna be able to do this game justice. And oh boy, forget about a Game Gear port! We were gonna need new technology to play these types of next-generation games, and as luck would have it, Sega was gearing up to sell you on either the 32X add-on or a brand new Saturn. Perfect timing! There's just one problem. By the time Sega was ready to sell America on a home version of Virtua Fighter 1, their even better sequel was already heating up the arcades. As a result, we saw the editors a bit underwhelmed by both of the Virtua Fighter ports. You initially saw that with the Saturn reviews, but that drumbeat was overpowering by the time EGM reviewed the 32X version in October 1995. SushiX lays it out clearly. I'm sorry, but the old looks of Virtua Fighter don't cut it anymore. I may be a bit harsh, but look at what else is out there. Virtua Fighter Remix, Toshinden, Tekken. Andrew gave the highest score and argued that it plays better than the Saturn version, but concluded that it's still just more of the same. Speaking of that Saturn version, the editors were excited to have a true 3D fighter at home, but were a bit mixed on the execution. While many were impressed that it looked and sounded so much like the arcade version, it was clear that the review crew hadn't been won over by the game's charm. SushiX ended up spending most of his review explaining that he prefers 2D fighters. I was never that big on Virtua Fighter when it was in the arcade. I don't particularly like the slow fighting style. I prefer the fast-paced Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter games. Yet, this game has a lot of moves and combos if you give it a chance. Dano had a similar take, but found that this console port actually changed his mind. I must admit that I despised the arcade version when I first tried it, but after playing it on the Saturn, I've grown to like it. In the battle for who had the best version of the original Virtua Fighter, the Saturn wins with an average score of 7.9 out of 10. Slightly higher than the 7.6 out of 10 that EGM gave the 32X version. Despite getting strong reviews at the time, Virtua Fighter 3 is often considered the lost game in the long-running franchise. It's easy to see why. The game originally came out at a time when the arcades were on the decline and didn't see a console port until the Dreamcast in 1999, when it was completely overshadowed by a little game you might have heard of called Soul Calibur. And while Sega made sure to re-release the other 4 main series installments multiple times throughout the years, Virtua Fighter 3 has remained a Dreamcast exclusive ever since it was first introduced 2 decades ago. But even at the time, you could tell that the excitement for the third Virtua Fighter game was way down. Sean argued that Virtua Fighter 2 TB has none of the flash that Soul Calibur has, nor is its combat system as enjoyable to fight with. He argued that while the sequel still holds its own, it looks rather dated and isn't as much fun as the competition. Even Shu, who gave the game the highest score, agreed that it can be extremely hard playing this game after being immersed in Soul Calibur-ness for so long. But if you purge that out of your system and start afresh, you'll find an excellent game in Virtua Fighter 3 TB. Sadly, this Sega sequel was not only overshadowed at the time, but continues to be to this day. With an average score of 8 out of 10, I would argue that Virtua Fighter 3 needs to be ported to something other than the Dreamcast. Only 2 years after the Saturn's launch, Sega was already in a bind. They wanted to continue making Virtua Fighter games, but the newest arcade sequel, Virtua Fighter 3, wasn't gonna be an easy fit on the 32-bit hardware. What's more, Sega had already released Virtua Fighter Remix, Virtua Fighter 2, and Virtua Fighter Kids all within a 15-month window. What was Sega to do? Well, as it turns out, the solution to that problem was to create a new mashup game called Fighters Megamix that saw the Virtua Fighter squad go up against the outlandish characters from Fighting Vipers. And just to sweeten the pot, Sega also threw in a bunch of characters from all sorts of their other games, including Sonic the Fighter, Virtua Cop 2, Virtua Fighter Kids, Rent-A-Hero, and Hornet, you know, the car from Daytona, USA. Electronic Gaming Monthly liked this mashup, for the most part. Crispin argued that no matter what your taste in fighting games, there's no excuse for passing up Fighters Megamix. It packs the reserved, thinking man's combat of Virtua Fighter 2, the flashy, button-slapping antics of Fighting Vipers, and the downright silliness of dozens of other bonus warriors from Sega's vast gaming universe. Sean was less impressed. This game is a lot of fun to play with a bunch of characters and even more secrets. But even with that said, I had trouble really getting into this one except for the 2-player mode. While the reviews were all fairly strong, it was clear that the editors were starting to tire of the Virtua Fighter formula. They complained about the button mashing as well as the easy difficulty. Still, even with the understandable criticism, this all-in fighting game averaged a score of 8.1 out of 10 and definitely should have been the start of a phenomenal new mashed-up super franchise. Sadly, Sega once again screwed up. Sega knew that Virtua Fighter was going to be a big selling point when it came to convincing people to take the plunge on their next-generation consoles. That might explain their rush to not only bring the first game to living rooms, but also the vastly improved sequel. Believe it or not, Sega released both Virtua Fighter 1 and 2 on the Saturn in 1995, a mere 7 months apart. And let's not forget about Virtua Fighter Remix, which came out only 2 months before Virtua Fighter 2. Look, the point I'm making is that Sega had packed a whole lot of Virtua Fighter into 1995. Yeah, even with all of that Virtua Fighter packed into such a short amount of time, the EGM editors were still excited for Virtua Fighter 2. The game was just that good. Andrew called it the best fighting game on the system and predicted that it would be Sega's best-selling game of the year. However, he complained that the graphics differ from the arcade hit. The backgrounds, in particular, suffer by having only 2 levels of parallax. The game looks a lot better than Remix, but not quite as good as the coin-op version. Sushi X liked that you could switch between the different versions of the game and was impressed by the graphics and sound, but admitted that he was never a big fan of the series and seemed a bit more comfortable with Tekken. Still, he was quick to praise the incredible AI and called it easily the best fighting game on the Saturn. Most agreed with that take, which is why Virtua Fighter 2 is ranked number 4 with an average score of 8.25 out of 10. Although Electronic Gaming Monthly acknowledged and even appreciated the impact it had on the fighting game genre, they were not in love with Virtua Fighter. I mean, the first few titles certainly scored well and led to competitors as diverse as Tekken and Tobal, but EGM didn't rank them as highly as what we saw from Street Fighter and Samurai Showdown. All that seemed to change the moment that Sega became a third-party developer, when the series suddenly became the magazine's gold standard for fighting games. To put it in perspective, all 3 of the Virtua Fighter games that we're going to be talking about next are among EGM's 7 best-reviewed fighting games of all time. That's nearly half the list. The lowest scoring of the bunch is Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution, which averaged a score of 9.5 out of 10. More than a full point higher than Virtua Fighter 2, which is in 4th place. Shane liked the game so much that he gave it a perfect 10. Here's a lesson on how to improve upon perfection. Take PS2's finest fighting game, add 2 creative new characters, program in scads of intensely challenging AI fighters, offer up mad unlockables, and spit polish the already amazing graphics. Then proceed to sell the tricked out remake for only $20. Che agreed, noting that even if you've seen most of this before, the real reason to plunk down $20 is for EVO's superb quest mode. It may have been more of an expansion pack than a new game, but Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution averages an impressive 9.5 out of 10. By the mid-2000s, the fighting game craze had largely been overshadowed by the popularity of online shooters and epic adventure games. But even though the community had shrunk, established franchises like Mortal Kombat, Soul Calibur, and the King of Fighters continued to push on with new installments. While those games were all met with solid scores, it was clear that Electronic Gaming Monthly had a favorite fighting game franchise, and that was Virtua Fighter. In fact, they loved the series so much that when they went to review Virtua Fighter 5 back in 2007, it ended up being their 5th best reviewed game of the year, ahead of Persona 3, Mass Effect, and both Gears and God of War. And with an average score of 9.7 out of 10, it's also the 2nd best Virtua Fighter game of all time. This point is not lost on Milkman, who started his review by noting that it's interesting that no matter how many top-tier fighters show up and try to steal Virtua Fighter's lunch money, none of them do. That task is even more difficult now because Virtua Fighter 5 kicks everyone's ass up and down the block. Sure, some fighting series like Soul Calibur and Tekken distract you with all kinds of extra modes and, bowling, but Virtua Fighter 5 rises above the pack thanks to the sheer depth of its gameplay. Brian also loved the game, but wasn't going to let it off the hook for its shortcomings. His biggest complaint? The utter lack of online goodies. I don't want leggy internet fights either, but at least throw me a bone with leaderboards or downloadable garb. I know that people are bitching about the price of the PlayStation 3, but think about this, fighting fans. Considering that this $60 game essentially replaces a $40,000 arcade cabinet, it sure seems worth it to me. I just want to point out that this ill-conceived logic can be used against, well, pretty much anything and falls apart the moment that you think about it. It's really a bad argument over the debate of the PlayStation 3's $600 asking price. But look, we're not going to get into that here, because Virtua Fighter 5 averages a bone-crunching score of 9.7 out of 10. Now this is what I call a photo finish. There is only a 1/10 of a point difference separating first and second place, leading to what many might consider to be a controversial winner. And while some may be surprised to see Virtua Fighter 4 come out on top, I would argue that it makes perfect sense when you consider the timing. When Sega released this long-awaited sequel in 2002, they were no longer a third-party console maker demonstrating their strength. Sega was a freshly minted third-party license, bringing one of their highest-profile games to the PlayStation 2. It was also a triumphant return for the Virtua Fighter franchise, which had largely been overshadowed by the newer and flashier 3D fighting games on the market. By creating an expertly crafted and incredibly polished sequel, this was Sega making a statement. If this is going to be the quality you can expect from a third-party Sega, then everybody else is going to need to up their game. For Electronic Gaming Monthly, Virtua Fighter 4 wasn't just another sequel. Looking back on the reviews now, you can tell that they considered this to be the first next-generation fighting game. Che couldn't believe the game's depth. The amount of interaction you have in the training mode and the length to which Virtua Fighter 4 actually eases you into the deepest hell gameplay is something unprecedented. In fact, Virtua Fighter 4's many features are so innovative, anything less from future console fighters will be disappointing. Milkman agreed, choosing to write a snarky letter to Soul Calibur. I'm sorry it had to be like this, but I've met someone else. What you and I had will always be special, but I need some room to grow and find myself. The new love of my life gives me joy in so many ways. Those ways included the cool promotion system, the incredible AI, beautiful graphics, and yes, deep gameplay. Nearly a decade after the release of the original Virtua Fighter, the series was once again setting the standard for 3D fighting games. This helped Virtua Fighter 4 average a score of 9.8 out of 10, making it not only one of the best reviewed games in the franchise, but also one of the highest rated games in EGM's 20-year history. Hey, thanks for watching me break down these Virtua Fighter reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we've been doing this for a bunch of long-running franchises, including Castlevania and Resident Evil, and even the Ghosts and Goblins verse. Now, here's the question I have for you. What is your favorite Virtua Fighter game? And also, do you plan on downloading the newest version of Virtua Fighter 5? Let me see your thoughts in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with a review of Hentai vs. Evil. You know, assuming YouTube will let me post it. We also have a viewer-requested Game Over episode to get to. In the meantime, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,